Shalom. I'm Rabbi Michael Panitz. I'm the Rabbi of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia, and I'm speaking to you from the pulpit of our congregation. At this time, I'll be addressing the topic, the poor person, other or brother. Who is the poor person, other or brother? On both sides of the Atlantic, at the end of the last millennium, a game show captured much of the perennial mood of the public. The British and American versions of the show were both called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? The title reveals a lot about inflation of both currency and ambition. The ancestor of that kind of show was the 1955 CBS quiz program, the $64,000 question. Yes, wealth is a goal for many in our society. How much would be enough? The question means one thing for those who are relatively comfortable, and quite another for those who are not. For those who are not objectively poor, but who are crippling their progress along the road of life by being permanently focused on having more, Judaism counsels reframing the issue. At this season of the year, our Jewish curriculum includes the classical ethical treatise Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the fathers. Fathers in this case meaning the founding fathers of rabbinic Judaism. In chapter 4, which we are now reading, the 2nd century rabbi Shimon ben Zoma famously asked, Ezehu Ashir, who is wealthy? And he answered, Hasameach bechelko, the one who is happy with his portion. His answer was intended to confound conventional expectations. Rather than asking the question, who is wealthy, quantitatively, Ben Zoma addressed the issue psychologically. It is important for us to recognize that Ben Zoma's question and answer should be understood in the context of a broader Jewish concern for the poor. It is intended to teach the individual how to be content. It is not intended to dull the keen edge of the moral mandate to help one's fellow. For those who are not at least economically secure, the question, how much would be enough, is indeed a sharp-edged one. This was the condition of most people for much of history. Until the Industrial Revolution, most people were peasants, and most peasants were poor. In the early days of the Industrial Revolution, people streamed to the cities and their factories because of that poverty, only to replace their experience of rural want with that of grinding urban poverty. And what about the Jewish people from that era? Before modern times, Jews were prevented by law and by prejudice from owning land or joining guilds, and they were often subject to ruinous taxation by the Gentile government. We know from the documents preserved in the Cairo Geniza how extensive was the problem of poverty facing the Jewish community. The Jewish community assessed its members heavily to meet the basic needs of the poor. Unlike the Christian cities of Reformation-era Germany, which vied with each other in creating anti-vagrancy laws designed to shunt the poor on to some other place. For the Jewish community in the Middle Ages, Gemilut Chasadim and Pidyon Shivuyim, meaning taking care of their local poor and even ransoming Jewish captives from afar, those were non-negotiable commandments. This was philanthropy to the point of self-sacrifice. Some of you may remember a slogan adopted by the United Jewish Appeal and then shelved back in the 1970s. because it did not fit with the mentality of the ease-seeking modern. The slogan was, quote, "Give till it hurts." Truly, in the pre-modern era, the working members of any Jewish community did give till it hurt. The problem of widespread poverty began to ease in mid-20th century America. It was a major advance of the post-World War II generation when comfort, if not affluence, became significantly more attainable. At mid-century, the so-called, quote, Treaty of Detroit gave the automobile assembly line worker the salary and benefits to achieve a modicum of comfort unknown to earlier generations of manual laborers. As Fortune magazine described it, the historic 1950 agreement between General Motors and the United Auto Workers, quote, made the worker to an amazing degree a middle-class member of a middle-class society. First time in history. Those advances for manual workers did not endure. Organized labor has declined in the last 3/4 of a century, especially following President Reagan's crushing the professional air traffic controllers in 1981. Today, income inequality in the United States between the highest and lowest wage earners is again growing more pronounced. The world today has much to learn from the fundamental Jewish approach to helping the poor. That approach is well expressed in the words of Leviticus, the 3rd book of the Bible, in this week's Torah portion. Quote, "Should your brother come to ruin, and he hire himself out to you, you shall not work him with the work of a slave. No man shall hold crushing sway over his brother. V'chiyamuch achicha imach v'nimkar lach lo ta'avod bo avodat aved. Uva'achechem b'nei Yisrael ish be'achiv lo tirdevo v'farach." Leviticus 25, verses 39 through 46 excerpts. For me, the key word in this Bible passage is achicha, your brother. How we respond to the poor depends on how we see them. Do we see them as the other, the constant drain on our resources, the unremitting challenge to our self-image as good people, the problem? Or do we see them as siblings, as brothers? You care for your brother quite naturally. Seeing the poor as your brother, not as the other, is the key. Are we in fact brothers? This is the great lesson of the second of the Bible's creation stories, the story of Adam and Eve, our primal parents. There are those who would read that story as a refutation of the scientific account of the rise of humanity. I would argue that they are missing the ethical thrust of the story, that as humans, we are one family. Little known fact, when Charles Darwin elaborated his theory of evolution by natural selection, he was personally motivated by an intense opposition to slavery. In Great Britain, in the second quarter of the 19th century, the defenders of the slave trade were championing the theory, not yet disproved scientifically in their day, that the different so-called races were in fact different creations. It was their way of calling black Africans, quote, subhuman, and thus justifying enslaving them. Darwin despised that. It was the under-the-surface moral passion that prompted him to investigate the origin of species. His work established scientifically the unity of the human family, regardless of skin color. Of course, the rabbis of old were not modern scientists, but they understood the moral stance that we are one human family. In their own analysis of the Adam and Eve story, They explained that among its moral implications is the promotion of peace among groups of people, based on the truth that, quote, no one can say, my father was greater than yours. Shelo yomar adam lechavero, Abba gadol me avicha. And this is the tractate Sanhedrin, the Mishnah, chapter 4, Mishnah 5. In its sober wisdom, the Bible cautions us that the poor will not cease from being part of our world. Deuteronomy chapter 15:11. For the pauper will not cease from the midst of the land. Therefore I charge you, saying, you shall surely open your hand to your brother, to your pauper in your land. Ki lo yachdal evyon mikerev haaretz, al kein anochi metzavecha lemor, patoach tiftach et yadecha leachicha la'aniyecha ule'evyoncha be'artzecha. The poor will be among us. In each generation, therefore, we must rise to the challenge to see them not as other, but as brother. Shalom.